Okay, I think we'll make a start and then I'll just keep an eye on those waiting to be admitted. Good. So I see some familiar names, which is always nice, but also some less familiar ones. So for those of you who don't know me and indeed the Insiders Outsiders project, I'll just begin, if I may, by saying a few words about that. My name, as you can see, is Monica Bohm-Duch, and I'm the founding director of what proved to be an ambitious and very rewarding cultural project, a year-long nationwide arts festival that took place between March 2019 and March 2020 to celebrate the deep and pervasive contribution of former refugees from Nazism to this country's culture. And well, COVID struck, luckily, just around the time the festival was due to end anyway, and it seemed quite natural as a sort of a consequence of that to go virtual, to go online. And it's given the festival, I have to say, an unexpectedly rich afterlife in the form of an ongoing program of online events covering a wide range of different media and topics, but all of them in some way related to the broad theme of the original festival. But one thing that's become of increasing interest to me, it's always been there, as indeed a second generation member myself, is to give the so-called second generation a chance for their voices to be heard, particularly those like Susannah, whose closeness to the topic of the festival itself is very clear, very, very deep-seated and often complex, certainly, and problematic, but to actually show the way that creativity can kind of grapple with, should I say, the complex nature of our parents' experiences. And on Monday evenings, it's become the sort of pattern that we have such events. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to part of what is indeed an ongoing series, but also that picks up the threads after a short break over the summer of the Insiders Outsiders project. It's good to see you here. And just a few very practical things. You all know the ropes ad nauseum now, I think, with Zoom, but if you can just make sure that you're all muted. We are recording the event. I'll say more about that at the very end. Cameras off if you wish, or not, as the case may be. I have highlighted our two participants so that you will be seeing them both on the screen at the same time as we progress. As regards asking questions or comments, if you wouldn't mind typing them in the first instance into the chat function, and we'll see how it goes. We've got a smallish, but no doubt select and committed audience tonight. So it would be nice to keep it quite informal and give you a chance to ask your questions yourselves, but let's see how that goes. So I think without further ado, a very brief introduction to our two interlocutors, shall we say, or rather Amy talking in conversation with Susannah. So let me say a few words about Susannah first of all. She's an actor and a writer. It sounds as though the writing, am I right, Susannah, is increasingly taking over from the acting, who grew up in London and also in the Midlands. The death of her father, Herbert Wise, Wise, in 2015 was the catalyst for her first novel, which is the main subject of this gathering tonight, This Fragile Earth. And I won't say more about it because, of course, much more will be said as we proceed. I'll just say that his preoccupation with astronomy and the beauty of the night sky formed the jumping point, one of the jumping off points for the story. Susannah studied at the Faber Academy, graduating actually quite recently in September 2018, during which time she wrote a second, more peculiar novel, and that's such a tantalizing way of putting it, so I hope we'll have a chance to hear more. Both books have been longlisted for the Dyslexia Prize, and she currently lives in London with her partner and her son. Amy Rosenthal, who will be talking to Susannah, they're old friends. It turns out they even went to the same school as I did some years earlier. Her plays, as I'm sure you all know, established and successful playwright. Her plays include Sitting Pretty, Henna Night, and On the Rocks, which was nominated for the International Susan Smith Blackburn Prize. Recent work includes a new play about the Mitford sisters, a rich, interesting topic. And she's also developing a feature film with Atlas Films, and you've said, Amy, a little bit about it, and if it seems right, I'd love you to share that with the audience. So without further ado, over to the two of you. I shall make myself visible and inaudible, and I very much look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Monica, and welcome everyone. It's a huge privilege for me to be here and chat to Susannah, my old friend and school friend, and someone who I've been a huge fan of as an actor and writer for many years. In fact, I used to edit the school magazine and still remember some of Susannah's stories almost quotably now. So I think the talent was always there. And it's very evidently there in This Fragile Earth, which is a beautifully written book that elegantly crosses several genres, including, well, predominantly science fiction, which I think, Susannah, you've said you wanted to make science fiction maybe more accessible to a female audience. And I think, well, that certainly worked for me. Because at heart, it's a very human story about a family, the protagonist, Signe, and her partner, Matthew, and their 6-year-old son, Jed, who are living in a London that we would all recognise, although the book is set in the future, so in many ways it's changed. But the kind of bricks and mortar London that we know is the foundation of where the novel begins. And something happens, something shifts, technology begins to break down, and the city becomes an unsafe place to be in a million different ways. And a terrible event leads Signe on an odyssey with her son across a shattered England. The characters are incredibly vivid and alive, and it feels to me like they exist outside the confines of the page, which is what I'm always looking for in a book or a play, and set in a world that feels even more fragile in many ways now than probably, Sus, it did when you started writing it. So we're going to kick off with a little excerpt from the book, which Susannah is going to read for you.
So, hello everyone. This is the book in its hardback formation, and I'm going to read from quite near the beginning of the book. By the way, little signs coming up saying my internet connection's unstable, so if I'm freezing, will somebody put it in the chat and I'll sort of move my computer into another part of my house. So this is near the beginning of the book, when the protagonist, Signe, and her 6-year-old son, Jed, have live in London with her partner Matthew, and the gas and electricity have shut off unexpectedly, and communications are starting to be patchy. Phone and internet is very patchy, and no one knows what's going on. So this is about day 3 of this sort of weird thing happening. They live in a flat in North London, and they have a neighbour who lives downstairs. Somebody was knocking on the door to their flat. "Michelle," she said. It couldn't be anyone else. Matthew didn't move. Signe sighed. "I'll get it." The downstairs neighbour stood on the top step, barely visible in the gloom. "Hi," said Michelle. She was 8 months pregnant. Her belly stuck out like the prow of a ship. Her bleached hair was growing out, the roots black and shiny. Her hand went to her head, as if reading Signe's thoughts. "I heard you pootling about up here." "Sorry," Signe said. "Was Jed making too much noise with his sawing and gluing?" "Oh, no, it's not that." Signe hoped the washing machine hadn't leaked again. The landing was small. Michelle took a step back as Signe opened the door fully. "Oops, don't fall off the stairs. How's the bump?" "Yeah, not bad. Do you have any water?" "Oh yes, but it tastes horrid." Signe's smile wavered. "Why, what's wrong?" "Mine stopped." There was a whooshing in Signe's ears like waves breaking. She steadied herself on the doorframe. "Really? Oh, God. Okay, please don't worry. You can use ours. 20 minutes ago, I drank from our bathroom tap. I swallowed some aspirins, headache." Michelle looked confused by the level of detail. "Thanks," she sniffed. "I don't want to bother you, you know." "Oh, no, it's fine. You can help yourself whenever. It tastes horrible, so boil it before you drink." "Well, I can't boil it, can I? No electric." "Oh, yes, sorry, of course." Signe laughed. Michelle was looking at her. "So can I come in?" "Oh, yes, sorry." She must stop apologising. She stood aside to let Michelle enter, but the hallway was too narrow for 2 people to stand side by side. There was a dance while they negotiated who would go first. Hi, Jed. Hi, Matthew. Michelle waved flaccidly as she passed the living room. Signe followed her into the kitchen. Jed ran forward, launching himself around Michelle's knees, almost tipping her sideways, his nose level with her crotch. We're building a house out of sticks. Michelle's hand went out to the wall. That sounds lovely. On Michelle's feet were Nikes with gold and pink flowers decorating the uppers. Michelle caught Signe's eye. I customised them myself. I can see. Nice. Made from recycled ocean plastic. Michelle spotted the camping stove. Portable cooker? Yeah. She hoped Michelle wouldn't expect to borrow that as well. The two women stood in the middle of the kitchen, Michelle's eyes roving. Her gaze fell on the saucepans of water sitting on the hob. You filled those up already? Well, you know. Signe waved her hand in the air. She nodded at Jed, who was busy retrieving a rubber-tipped arrow from beneath the table. Go and play in the other room, monkey. She jibbered him out. Her voice dropped. I'm worried, honestly. Yeah, me too. Anyway, here's the tap. I'll fill you a bucket. It's been sterilised. Our cleaner, Bessie, is amazing. She wished she hadn't said that. Signe fetched the bucket from underneath the sink and hit the tap. Water spat and coughed, then gushed out. When the bucket was half full, the water pressure weakened. She watched as the stream became a trickle, a steady drip, then dribbled away to nothing. Matthew? He entered the kitchen fast, Jed in his slipstream. They clustered around the sink, Jed shifting foot to foot at Matthew's flank. What's wrong, Mama? Nothing, love. Is it no water? No, yes, it is no water. That's not good, is it? Michelle was curling her fingers around the handle of the bucket and lifting it from the sink. Signe had that whooshing feeling again. She put her hand on Michelle's arm. I'm so sorry. Michelle's eyes were big. What do you mean? Well, I didn't know ours had run out. You can have one glass, but we'll need the rest of that for Jed. I'm sorry. But you've got 3 saucepans on the oven. Yes, but there are 3 of us living here, including a child. But I'm pregnant. There was silence. Matthew and Signe stood next to one another, shoulders touching. Michelle frowned. They all stared at the bucket. Have you got apple juice? Jed's voice, like a bell. No, sweetheart, I haven't got no apple juice. We have. He went to the fridge. He handed Michelle some warm, fermented juice. Signe scooped up a glass of water from the bucket, swallowing the lump in her throat. Like I said, I'm really sorry, Michelle. I think we'd all just better get on now. Why was she being so horrible? Why wasn't she sharing? Okay, sure. Michelle stared out of the kitchen window at the sky. Matthew laid a palm on Signe's shoulders. He took a step forward. I'm so sorry we can't be of more help, Michelle. I really don't think this will go on long. We'll make it up to you when it's fixed. He smiled. Michelle left with the apple juice carton and her 1 glass of water. Signe's hands shook as she closed the door.
Thank you.
Is that?
Thank you. So that is a brilliant illustration of how the novel examines the ways in which we behave, the ways in which we think we might like to behave or imagine we would behave in crisis, and whether what we hope we would be measures up to what we turn out to be. Suze, I'd love to ask you about the genesis of the novel, how it was born, where it sprang from, how it changed in the writing process. Where did it all begin?
Okay, so I had never written long form prose before, although I'd written a lot of poems and short form prose. I did not have this story in my head at all. In 2015, in about February, March of 2015, I was doing a play at the Young Vic. So I was very busy because I was doing 8 shows a week. My father, who was 90, nearly 91 at the time, had this very slow moving form of prostate cancer, and then he had a very minor procedure for something else, and it seemed to trigger something, and suddenly this prostate cancer was like galloping through his body. And the oncologist had given him various chemo tablets and whatever. And on the day that we discovered, we had the phone call saying, I'm afraid it's not working. There's nothing more we can do for you now. It's going to be palliative care from here on in. My dad had this sort of rather kind of factual reaction to the whole thing, and sort of went, right, well, fuck it, you know, there you go. I mean, literally, that was sort of, he went, right. And everyone in the house was quite silent. And I went home that night and I lay in bed, and as a sort of knee-jerk reaction to this news, instead of worrying about my dad, I had this catastrophic fantasy, which is something that I've done all my life, especially as a child. It's quite a childlike thing, I think, where instead of worrying about the thing that you're meant to be worrying about, I created a whole story that was completely nothing to do with anything. And my thoughts were, what is the worst possible thing that could happen to me and my then 4.5-year-old son? And within about an hour, I'd come up with the entire story of this fragile life, the whole plot. And I was sort of shaking because it was so horrendous, because it was first, you know, the gas electricity gets cut off, then the water gets cut off, then, and I won't give away the plot, but, you know, all the things that are in the book. I started writing it the next day, and I sat down and wrote and thought, well, I'm a very impatient person, and I thought I'm never going to have the, you know, ganas to sit down and write a whole book, but I'll just start. And I wrote about 10,000 words while I was still working in the evenings and matinees on the play. And then when I finished the play, my dad became very sick, and we nursed him at home until he died in the August. That was about, I don't know, 4 months. There was sort of hiatus in the middle. And then after he died, I just sat down and started writing again. And I'm not kidding, I just have not stopped writing since then. So I've now written, I'm just completing my 3rd novel. So it's been a real surprise, no one more surprised than myself, I have to say. And it certainly wasn't a story that I'd carried around in my heart. But I know we're going to talk a little bit more probably about where the unconscious plot of this book may have sat and rested in a minute.
We are. It's amazing. I mean, hearing you say that now, it just strikes me that it's almost like a sort of gift that came with the loss.
That's exactly how I have thought of it. And I wrote in an article actually that I wrote about the book that it was my father's last best gift to me. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know that sounds a little, my dad would hate to hear anything so saccharine, but that is a bit like what it feels like. And I feel like, I mean, the best joke for my dad, as I always said to my mum, is that he'd die and then realise that there was a heaven, because he was completely non-religious. So I hope that he is going, I was wrong, and he's somewhere in the ether looking down and like being proud, because I know he would be very proud.
Very proud, and also that he would have wanted you to have something to keep you going through that awful time.
Yeah, for sure.
And not for you to reduce the suffering or help you balance the grief, and it's been the fact that it's been that, I think, would make him very happy.
Absolutely. And you've lost your father as well, Amy, haven't you? So you know what that's like, and and I'm sure plenty of people who are here tuned in today have also lost relatives, and it doesn't go away. It just sort of, I don't know, it's like peaks and troughs. I don't know if you find that, but sometimes I really miss my dad, and sometimes I don't think about him for days. And yeah, it's funny how it creeps up on you. In a way, it's like a way of keeping him alive, I suppose, because there is a father figure who is dead in the book, but his presence is quite strong, isn't it? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. It's strong and steady, and he just makes little gentle appearances that feel very important. Even though you don't put any weight on them as being heavy in terms of the plot, but he's just always there, and it feels as though something of his spirit and philosophy kind of underpins the whole project somehow.
Okay.
And I want to talk more about that, and more specifically about your dad and about his experience and how that relates to the book in what I think is a fantastically subtle way. But first, I just wanted to ask you about something that I found fascinating, which is the time in which you've chosen to set the novel. And I think you've done something very clever, which is to set it in a very recognizable world, in many ways, particularly specific to North London, Central London, references to Kentish Town and Regent's Park and very particular landmarks, and also the way of life that we all know. But everything has changed. We are in the future, things have moved forward. The things that we find kind of staggering today about technology have moved forwards hugely. But what's clever is that it's not insanely different. It's not like we're all living in glass houses and flying. But we still have cars, we still have many of the trappings of the life we know, but everything has shifted technologically, probably in the way that it has since we were kids, another massive leap. And that makes it feel actually makes it feel that when the terrible things start to happen, I almost felt that I was already living in a dystopian world, just in the world that you'd set it in the first few pages. That there are elements like nobody can go outside without UV glasses. There are just delicate suggestions constantly that the impact that we've had on the earth in the intervening years has made everything worse. Without making it sound too bleak, because I should say that there is humour in this book as well. The tone has many textures to it. But yeah, I just wanted to ask you about that choice to set it in the future, and whether it was always going to be in the future, and how that came about.
So it was always going to be in the future, and as I say, I wrote a draft of it in 2015, going into the first half of 2016, and I set it in 12 years in the future. So whenever about 2028 was when I set it. And as I got to the end of it, I thought, and as time went on, and by the way, I didn't have an agent. I wasn't even represented until the beginning of, when was it? End of 2018. I got an agent, and then a publishing deal followed after that, about a year after that. So just to give you some context, I was submitting the novel, and I did have quite a few agents interested, but they wanted to work on the novel with me. So it was quite a long time. And as it got towards sort of 2017, 2018, I was thinking, I don't think 2028 is going to be the right place for it. So it moved, and it kept jumping up in time. And eventually, as I was working on it with my present agent, she suggested moving it quite substantially forward, and it's an unspecified date, but I see it in my head somewhere around late 2058, 2060, something like that. But the reader can make their own conclusion, can draw their own conclusions. There's no correct answer to when it is set, but it is in the near future. But like you say, it had to be, for myself, I thought it was more frightening as a writer and a potential reader when I kept it in a very, very recognizable world. If I'd moved it to a point where then you suspend your disbelief to the point where it doesn't feel like it's happening to you as a reader, and I wanted it to feel like it was something. And then, of course, we had the pandemic, and it got even more. Some people have said to me, "Oh God, I had to put the book down because I was having a panic attack because it was so redolent of what's happening." Obviously, it's not a viral apocalypse that happens in my book, I would just say, but there is mention of some past viral outbreaks, more kind of farm-led viral outbreaks that have affected the human population as well as the animal population.
And that's still an ongoing threat.
And it's still an ongoing threat, exactly. And I just wanted everything to feel a little bit like, can you trust anything? Can you trust the water? Can you trust, the sky, light? Can you trust the food you're eating? And I think we all do have these questions in our minds now. It's just that when you live with them in the present in a non-emergency situation, it doesn't feel so raw. But you know, when I was writing, I was part of a North London writers group, very brilliant literary fiction writers, who are almost to a man and woman Jewish, weirdly. But they said to me when I was first writing it in 2000, reading it in 2015, they said, "Oh, day two, and everyone's running to the supermarket and buying loo rolls. That seems a bit soon." And then we had the pandemic, and you know, there we were with all the toilet rolls going, the pasta, and I felt very vindicated.
Absolutely. I mean, it is very, very prescient. It's almost impossible to believe when you're reading it now that you were writing it so far before, not just before the pandemic, but pre-Brexit.
Yes, pre-Brexit, because in my book initially I had I thought, oh, I'll do something fun where we're all now paying for things in euros. This was when I still had it in 2028. I thought we'll all pay for things in euros. Then Brexit happened. I was like, oh, it'll be pounds. And then I moved it forwards and thought, oh, we won't be using money at all. We'll be using, Bitcoin or whatever. So yeah, it moved around. Even the currency moved a lot.
Yeah.
It was like when I was writing it, I felt like I did a draft, and then it was a bit like adding paint or adding layers to an onion, where I was adding more world building elements to it each draft that I did. So, for example, in the book as it's published, the road, the surface is like fiberglass, and that was a very late addition because, of course, as soon as you have smart cars, you want a road surface that talks to the car and tells the car what's good and not working about the car, etc., etc. So those were things that I added in quite late in the day,
which all seem kind of alarmingly possible.
Yeah.
I think, that it makes it feel both eternally relevant, well, very specifically relevant now, but as we've touched on, it also feels the kind of breakdown of civilization, the breakdown of human relationships, and the testing of people's goodwill, and the turning of people against their neighbours, feels relevant to crises past as well as present, and as well as whatever may happen in the future. And I guess that's the next thing that I wanted to ask you about. And in a way, in terms of this discussion, perhaps the most important thing is that there is a kind of underskin to this story, which is to do with your father's history and experience as Kindertransport survivor from Austria. I'd love you to talk.
Yeah. Okay. So my dad came on the Kindertransport age just 14, I think, in 1938. He'd grown up in Vienna, the son of a tailor. They were quite wealthy, and then he was put on the train by a cousin because his mother, my grandmother, couldn't bear to go to the station to take him. She was going to find it too upsetting. So he was taken on his own, and he was put on the train on his own. He had a brother who was still in Vienna. They'd had some very traumatic experiences already. My grandfather had spent some time in a concentration camp just before the war broke out, and my grandmother, I don't know how, but she brought him out or did something and got him out. My grandparents had, scrubbed the streets with toothbrushes. My dad had found Nazi officers in his Gestapo in his flat, who taking all the jewellery, and he'd been hit. And anyway, he got on the train and travelled through the night.
He obviously had a clear understanding of why he was being taken out.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he knew fully what was going on, and people at school talk about neighbours dobbing on each other, and left behind. Everybody came to England, was raised in Kent by an adopted family. His brother came 6 months later, also on the Kindertransport, and was taken to a separate family, and they lived nearby but not in the same household. And he never went back to Vienna apart from as an adult, not as a young man, because he found it too painful. My grandparents fled to Brazil, as did a few of the other relatives. Everyone else went to the gas chambers and to concentration camps. My father's favourite and most dear cousin, Goethe, stayed in Vienna to nurse her sick mother who couldn't leave their apartment. The mother died while they were holed up in the apartment, and then Goethe went mad, and then she was carted to a concentration camp and gassed. So that was my father's nearest and dear. I mean, it's awful. It just makes me feel like crying. Anyway, that's what happened to them. And so all of these things, obviously, my dad didn't talk about this stuff much when I was a kid. It was very present, but it wasn't discussed a lot. And my dad would say things like, well, what is there to say? There's nothing to say. Probably also wanted to protect his children from some of the more horrendous aspects. But it must have been sitting under there, because when I'd finished writing the novel, and I don't mean I put the pen down and went, oh my God, but I mean like some time later, almost as the book was getting ready to be published, I realised that I'd written sort of my father's Holocaust journey. I mean, not directly, bit by bit, but I'd written this sort of fleeing survival story to a mother and her little boy on their own, running away from, you know, a dangerous situation, only to find themselves in another dangerous situation. And there is some very strong imagery, I realised, towards the latter part of the book. I think I can say it without giving anything away. They come across this septic tank full of the clothing belonging to these villages. This village is empty, and they find a lot of clothing that belong to various people they recognise. Well, I mean, I don't know how I didn't. This is like what's so amazing to me is I made no connection between the death camps and my book and this imagery that I'd made. It was only a long time afterwards when I read it back and I thought, oh my God, I've written this imagery. It must have been sitting inside my head or in my body somewhere in my cells and just come out unconsciously. Yet it's so obvious when you look at when I read it back, but later, much later.
Yeah. And was it that specific bit about the clothes?
Well, that was the most,
to
me, the most obvious. I don't know if you've read the novel, if there's some other bits that
I suppose I read the novel with the knowledge of your history and also of what you'd spoken about. But I guess the other part, the clothes definitely did have that resonance for me. But there's also another part much earlier on when Signe and Matthew and Jed are trying to get back into their house, and London is in chaos. So it's long before she's on her odyssey alone with her son. It's near the beginning, but they're trying to get back to their house. They can't get across the road to their own house, and they are under threat from other people in their community. And there's a sense of them, of the sort of the haves and the not haves, and of a kind of social envy and assumptions being made about them as a family. They're let across the road.
Yeah, and other people
aren't. And I suppose for me that had a sort of resonance, I guess, in terms of thinking about Jewish history and assumptions that are made, and envy and hatred that is generated for reasons that are often completely wrongly construed. That was the other bit where it really struck me. I mean, this sounds like total armchair psychology, but when you were just talking then about it, I felt like I wondered if in a way the whole writing of it is a kind of is you saving your dad. It's you escorting, as well as being about you and your son. It's kind of you escorting a little boy to safety.
I think that's exactly it. I think that's what it is, and I had no idea that that's what it was. And this dead father figure in the book, who is Signe's father, who's not alive, who is very philosophical and has some kind of really interesting, I think, ideas about the universe. is a bit like a god figure, who and the child is the sort of mouthpiece for this dead father's philosophizing or ideas about how the earth works or the universe, and I thought, God, that's really interesting. I said, like, it was like a big soup in my head. It was like come out in some, creative form. It's kind of great, but yeah.
And I wonder whether doing that, the process of that, whether because we've talked, you and I have talked, and I guess running under this is the notion of inherited trauma, and which the loss of your dad and the writing process has unearthed a sense of that for you. So I wondered if you'd talk about that a little bit, also about those figures that you mentioned, your dad's cousin and her mother, and how they reappeared in a significant way for you. And I guess also whether the process of writing whether you feel it has healed something or in terms of that trauma.
So I'll talk a bit first about the inherited trauma. So I would say that I was a very worried child, obsessed with death, and always felt a sense of loss. But sort of younger than one would expect, so 3, or I used to go up to my room and I remember just lying on the floor and feeling incredibly melancholic. And you and I, Amy, talked a lot about the Jewish people understanding the overlap between, tragedy, melancholia, and sort of the absurdity,
humor,
the absurdity of life. And I would just feel this deep sense of melancholy. And I remember just touching my heart like this, just rubbing my heart continually. I used to take my top off and just lie there and just rub my chest, which felt so bruised. And I think that I was, this idea of epigenetics and carrying the gene trauma, which we'll all be familiar with, I'm sure, of our ancestors, and mine obviously is directly above me, as well as the generations above that. I mean, my mother's side also had quite a traumatic start, and not that far back, but very traumatic. So I had it on both sides, and I was doing some in 2019 I got suddenly very sick with a non-specific autoimmune condition, a bit like lupus. So I'd never had any problems in an autoimmune way, not one, nothing. And suddenly I had all of them, and I was very ill, and I was very worried, as were lots of doctors who kept thinking that I had brain tumours or, I don't know, various sort of terminal illnesses. Anyway, eventually it turns out I'd got this weird systemic autoimmune, which I now sort of manage. But I have had some fun and very expensive journeys into how to sort of approach, I suppose, this condition that I find myself with. So on one hand, obviously lots of medical things, some alternative things, and then also some psychological things. I've seen all kinds of things. So I've seen some shaman, and I've had some hypnosis, and I've done this and that. One of the things that I decided to do was some eye movement desensitization reprogramming, acronym EMDR, which is very good for post-traumatic stress disorder, which I was diagnosed with at the end of 2018, for some things that I won't bother going into here. I found this wonderful professor. He was a child psychologist as well as being a specialist in military trauma, because he had been in the military, and he was very open. He talked very openly in the press about being bipolar and having suffered from depression and various things. So he sounded like a really interesting guy. He is a practicing Christian. I'm not religious, but so I thought that was a really interesting aspect of his character too. So I was fascinated by that, and I felt really safe with him. I was saying to you earlier, Amy, and it's interesting because there's quite a lot of military stuff in my novel. I feel very safe around military people. I've had several military boyfriends, and I enjoy, although I am really quite a left-wing person, I enjoy spending time around people in the military. I feel extremely safe. So he started these sessions with me. We had to do them on Zoom because of the pandemic. In one, I had about 7 sessions. So in about session 5, I was talking about feeling scared a lot at night, and I've always had these sort of night terrors. And I said, oh, I feel like there's some. It was very dark. It's in the winter, so and my room is. This is not my bedroom. My bedroom's quite dark. And I said, oh, I can feel like there's. He said, why do you keep turning around? I said, I feel like there's somebody behind me. I feel like there's spirits in the room. I feel like really spooked. And then we had to end the session. And I was super spooked for about 3 nights. I couldn't sleep very well because I thought, what's going on? And then the next session, he said, right, let's talk about these invisible ghosts that you feel at your back. We talked a lot about my dad and my mum, and I was trying to work out. I said, they feel like ancestors. They feel like ancestors at my back. And I was trying to work out, it was my grandmother, who I was very maternal grandmother, very close to. No, I'd never met my paternal grandparents. They died before I was born, so didn't feel like them. It felt like a quite young woman and a much older woman. And I said, I feel like I've got a cloak on, and they're like hanging off the back of it, and they're pulling me backwards. Anyway, I suddenly went, oh my God, and then burst into tears. And obviously I've already talked about this in our session now, so it won't be such a surprise, but I hadn't remembered that my dad had a cousin he loved, had lived in an apartment with her mother. I'd completely not thought about that since I was about 9. And I said, it's Goethe, it's this woman, and it's her and her mother, and they're hanging on the back of me, and they want to be manifest. They need my help. So we sort of worked through like releasing them and, putting them in a pool and then pulling them out. It's a very, it sounds crazy, but it's a very, if anyone's done it, you'll know. So it's a very sort of, you do a lot of visualization, and it's great if you're a writer because it's just let your imagination go. And it was really wonderful. Turned out to be what had been quite a spooky experience, turned out to be a very, very sort of cathartic, healing experience. And I felt very moved, and it was really wonderful. I felt like I had helped them come to some peace as well. And you asked me another question, which I was going to answer at the end, which ties into this. Oh, was the writing of the book cathartic
for you? Yeah.
And I think, yes, in the same way, the writing of the novel felt very cathartic. Maybe not for my dad's Holocaust trauma, because I wasn't aware of that, but it did definitely fill this empty hole that I was talking about from when I was a child. It filled this hole up, and I don't feel empty inside anymore. Like I feel really whole. It sounds so American, but I do. That's how I feel from writing.
Yeah, I think that it does have the power to do that, and it's such a consolation prize to have that in life. I think I'm really aware that time has just completely overtaken us, and I did want to ask something else, but how are we doing for time and questions? Because I don't want to take up other people's questions.
Carry on. I'm sure everybody will agree with me that we could listen to you for much, much longer. It's absolutely mesmerizing and very touching at the same time. So do carry on for a little bit longer. Sure.
Okay, great. Because I just, and it is connected to what we were just talking about. There's a moment towards the end of the book that, again, felt very resonant for me, without giving too much away. There's a brief, bleak interaction with a character called Hope. And the little boy, Jed, says quietly, go away, Hope. Not directly to her, but go away, Hope. And I suppose when I read it struck me as a choice of name. And I wondered about the consciousness of choosing that name, and the idea of a little boy saying, go away, Hope. Because I suppose in terms of what we just touched on about this kind of tug of war that I think is in the Jewish psyche, between a deep melancholy and a kind of unshakable amusement at life, and a kind of optimism that surges up despite yourself. And it sometimes in the shadow of that, the concept of hope can feel quite dangerous is it dangerous to be hopeful? Is it better to live with fear and with a kind of with the jackboots always on the stairs and with always thinking that doom is coming? Does that keep you safe in some way? And yes, is hope something that you're tempted to say, go away hope, don't be too hopeful? Because it's when you're hopeful, and this is, I suppose, I feel what's slightly I've inherited, is this notion that it's when things are going well, that's when they come and get you. So don't ever be too happy.
It's so true. It's so true. I mean, I absolutely identify with everything you said. I do live my life by don't be too hopeful, just in case, because it's bound to go to shit if you have too much hope. It was a conscious choice to have the name of that character as Hope, not because she represented hope, because she doesn't, as you know. But yes, there was originally a character in the novel called Justice, which was an unborn child, and that is not in the book anymore. But that was one of the last line of the original book was something like justice, and you know, in the light of us now talking about this sort of unconscious scene of my father's this inherited traumatic experience, it's so obviously even more clear that that's what I was writing. I'd literally written the name Justice. So yes, it was very much a conscious choice. But the language Go Away Hope was not that was just, I just loved the kind of ridiculousness of the fact that her name was Hope, and she's a pretty horrible character.
Mm-hmm.
I like the irony of it. That was my Jewish humor.
Yeah, exactly. It's underpinning everything quietly. Irony. And do you want us to feel hope at the end? Do you want how do you want to leave your readers?
I hope that there is some hope at the end. As I mentioned to you before, Amy, the original ending was much bleaker. I mean, I didn't see it as bleak because I have quite like my dad, I have quite a sort of nihilistic, or at least I try to see the universe in slightly more important than just human beings. So it was a less hopeful ending for human beings, but a potentially more hopeful ending for the Earth, because we wouldn't have been on it. But that was just too much for some beta readers to swallow, and so I wisely did as I was told, and changed the ending. And I'm glad that I did, because I think it's really important to have some hope at the end of the novel. It's quite a hard read in that respect. I mean, I think.
Yeah, well, you take us on a tough journey, and also you engage with one engages with these characters and cares, and so you want the best for them,
for sure.
You want to feel hope for them. And finally, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about what you're writing next and what you've written since. And
Sure. So I've written my second novel that's coming out in around about July. Well, it says my editor, it might actually be September, but next year it'll be out, 2022. And that is called Okay Then That's Great, all one word. And it is a dark comedy about grief, odds. It's very, very different to the first book, so it has no science fiction elements to it, but it does have quite a lot of surreal and some magical realism. It's a book that I really like a lot, and it's very dear to my heart, because I feel like there's a large portion of myself that's in it, if that makes sense, or at least it's like looking into the inside of my head, which is quite a mess.
More so than This Fragile Earth, would you say?
Yes, I would say so. Yes, I would say it's more when I say it's quite a mess, I don't mean like I'm a mess. I mean like it's messy. It's just like scattered, it's scattered. So I really like the book. I've got a feeling that it's going to be a real Marmite book. Some people are going to absolutely hate it and just put it down, not be able to read it, and some people are going to really love it. and there's nothing I can do about that. And then I've nearly finished my third novel, which is a more along the lines of the first novel. It's not science fiction, but it's set in a very small village in Cumbria, present day. And it's about an outsider coming into some very rum goings on in a small village with some very posh old people. It has some pig cloning and some, you know, some odd behaviors, shall we say. So slightly, you know, I'm very interested in those sort of small village mentalities that are very suspicious of outsiders and have their own ways of doing things that they think is fine.
Wow, they all sound very different. Do you think, you know, everyone always says that you've writers, that we all repeat a theme. Do you think there's something that links the three books apart from you?
I can't see it at the moment, but I dare say, a bit like when I looked at This Fragile Earth afterwards and thought, I will go, oh God, that's so obvious. Of course, that's what linked them. I can't see it right now, except that in all my novels, I have a very absent, the partner is either absent, or in the third novel, the partner has already died before the book begins, or absent-minded, or goes missing, or I have these absent partners of the protagonists. My three protagonists are female. My fourth book that I want to write is going to have multiple narratives, so there will be men and women, and I haven't written a multiple narrative book before, so I'm really looking forward to that. And it's going to be a comedy where nothing happens. I've decided.
Well, it feels like you get as much joy from writing the bleak ones as the joyful ones.
Yeah, well, I do, but I mean, you know, I do actually, and in some ways they're easier to write, but yeah, I'm not sure I don't know. Anyway, we'll see. You're writing a script, Amy. Do you want to mention your script that you're writing at the moment?
No.
You don't. Amy's writing a great script at the moment.
I'm right at the beginning of a process which is not unconnected to some of the themes that we've been talking about, and it's a really interesting story, a true story, but I'm not going to say any more about it because we're so tight on time, and I think people have put questions maybe, so I don't want to take up other people's time. Monica,
okay, if you're sure you don't want to tell us more, that's obviously fine.
Another time.
Indeed, well, we look forward to seeing evidence of it in due course. Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was truly wonderful. I'm sure everybody will agree. There's one question that's coming in, and as I said earlier, it's a fairly small gathering tonight for whatever reason. There were many more people signed up, but maybe vaguely summer evening, whatever, a surfeit of Zoom, who knows. But let me just say, while I think about it, that the recording will go on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. So do tell friends, acquaintances, associates that there will be an opportunity to revisit this wonderful conversation. But there is a question from Julia Edwards, who I can see on the top of my screen, saying she actually didn't hear the beginning, but she's asking a question which, Susannah, you've perhaps significantly kind of not delved into, and that is your mother in relation to your father's experience, and indeed what the traumas in your mother's life, what bearing that might have on what you've been talking about.
Okay, that's a very good question, and a very long answer. I'll try and keep it as short as I can. My maternal grandmother, who was the only grandparent that I know, I was very close to, she was raised as an Irish Catholic in a very in London, very poor. I mean, really, like on the bottom of the economic strata, whatever. And she had 12 brothers and sisters, and she discovered on her wedding day, age 22, that she was not Irish at all, and she was not related to any of the people that she'd been raised with, and that she was actually, her mother was called Isabel Altenberger, and her father was unknown. She then spoke to her, what she had assumed was her mother was actually her adopted mother, who had sworn the entire family to secrecy, and they told her that she was Swiss German. My mother then did some digging much later on and discovered that actually she was German. She'd been born in a workhouse on Neal Street in Covent Garden, which is now a very swanky members club called the Hospital. And she'd, had this very difficult childhood. My mum then was born to my grandmother. There were 3 siblings. My grandfather, my mum's dad, was killed on the last day of the war, as he insisted on going to work on VE Day, even though my grandmother said, don't go, no one's going to be working, it's going to be a national holiday. He went to work and said to his children, I'll meet you at the cinema. I'll take you to the cinema as a treat. They didn't have much money. They made him sandwiches. All the 3 children went to the cinema and waited outside, and he never came because he'd been run over by an army truck of celebrating soldiers. He wasn't wearing a helmet. You didn't have to wear a helmet in those days. And they just, they turned left, he turned right, something like that. And they crashed into each other and he died instantly. So my mother was 4, and she was the youngest of the 3. And then they had no dad, and then they had no income. So they lived in great poverty. And my grandmother then married again in order to get a council house, because you had to be married to get a council house. And she married not a great guy. They had 1 more child, and they lived in this tiny little house made of tin, pretty much. And that's how my mother was raised. So my mother was raised with great shame about her poverty, and went to drama school at 16, changed her name, acquired a posh accent, and has sort of completely not changed her identity, because of course she hasn't, but just a very, very difficult childhood. So yes, I mean, I haven't written that story yet. But I had 2 parents who had suffered greatly, and in one generation I was living in a very nice house in North London, and my dad sent me to private school. I mean, it was completely different. I'm not saying everything was perfect in my life, because it wasn't, but economically and in terms of the security aspects, in one generation, these 2 people who had these very traumatic childhoods and past met and created this stable home for me and my brother.
I was going to ask you about that, and perhaps my first question, that's a natural sequel to what you've just been saying, is: are you aware to what extent your parents spoke to each other about their respective traumas and the complexity of that?
In all honesty, not really. My parents had their own. I mean, my dad used to say, I love your mum first, and then you and your brother afterwards. It was very much my dad's focus when I was small, maybe not so much when I was older, but when I was little, was my mum. And my mum obviously was focused on the children more, but they were very tight. And I don't really feel like I had a sense of how much they spoke about that stuff. If they did, I'm sure they did talk about it, but they certainly didn't relay any of their conversations to me. And I still don't know to what extent they talked about it.
It rings such a strong bell for me, and I suspect
Yeah.
people in the audience, absolutely. And what about your sibling, your brother? I mean, to what extent is he willing and able to engage with, particularly both parents' experiences in the way that you have clearly been trying to do?
So my brother's my brother's 6 years younger than me, and he's second child, obviously, so didn't get the full, the parents' full, whatever it is, worries about having children, and how was the child, going to even survive, or whatever, all the worries that we have as parents with first children. He's got a very different emotional metabolism to me anyway. I do know that epigenetically, scientifically, they say that sometimes it can miss entirely, like it can be with one sibling and then not with the other one. My brother is very introspective. He's very good at looking at himself, and he's done lots of therapy and stuff. And his response to my dad and trauma is to become very engaged with. So he has 11 hours of film of my dad talking about his childhood right up through all of his career, because he was a very successful film director, and all through his life and every aspect of his life. So that's something that my dad sat with, and my brother sat with my dad and took the time to film that, because that was his way of engaging.
Will he do anything with it?
I was going to say, what's he going to do with it?
Well, he would love to, I think, write a film especially about, he talked to me about one aspect of my father's career, which is actually really would make a great movie, and it's quite funny. as well as being quite sad. It's not about his Holocaust journey or anything. It's about much later on when he was working with a very famous actor who is an alcoholic, and there's an amazing story about my dad going on a journey to try and get hold of this very famous actor, traveling miles to Mexico to try and get him. So yeah, my brother wants to make a film about that, but that is I don't know, my brother's so busy doing his job, which is not in the arts. I mean, it's arts affiliated, but it's a business that works alongside RADA. So yeah, I don't know when he's ever going to have the time to do that. Maybe I need to write it, but I don't think he'd thank me for doing that.
But it feels like there's something important about keeping the legacies of these people, our parents, who've been really titanic figures in their fields, and now as time passes and that you want them to be remembered, and actually what you're doing even in having these conversations is, you know, as well as keeping his memory alive, you know, maybe also hopefully prompting people to go back and look at the work and think, what did Herbie Wise direct? And you know, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
I suspect we should be drawing to a close shortly, but I can't resist asking a very obvious final question about the third generation. Your son is no doubt growing up rapidly. He sounds like a very talented writer in embryo, or perhaps beyond the embryonic stage from what you say. But tell us, perhaps by way of conclusion, how you feel you might protect him, your sort of urge to protect and yet to transmit at the same time. It's an important question, I think, for many of us.
Absolutely. It's really interesting because Amy and I were talking about this recently. My son is 11 and a half, so he's just started secondary school, and I don't have a very large family. Obviously most of them are dead, and so my son sees my side of the family quite a lot because my brother and my mother live literally around the corner, but how much he's engaged with the background is a question that Amy asked me, and I said, you know, I don't know. He's very engaged. My partner is as English as could be, and has like traces, you know, his uncles traced his family back to, I don't know, Edward II, or God knows what. But they've got thousands of relatives. There are like 4 siblings in each family. If you know what I mean, it's like one of those family trees that's like this. There are millions of them. And my son is very engaged with his family history on that side because they keep it alive, and my uncle-in-law writes history books about their family, and they talk about their past a lot. It's so interesting because the past on my side of the family is also extremely rich, but it's so threaded with pain and, you know, sort of horror. It's very difficult to talk about it at any length without sort of dribbling to a conclusion of, I'm talking about water drying up. It's, you know, I find the sort of tap dripping because I don't want to fill my son with horrible images. He does know what the Holocaust is, and he knows exactly my dad's history. But he did, when he was 6, he said to me one evening, I'm grateful to Hitler. And I said, what? Getting ready to sort of like cry or get cross or something. And he said, no, because Mum, if Hitler hadn't existed, Baba, so my dad, he called him Baba, Baba would never have come to this country. He never would have met my mother, and he never would have had you, and then I never would have been born. So Hitler's the reason that I'm here. Which I thought was a really interesting way of, I mean, I couldn't disagree with it because it's true. But it took me by surprise. It really took me by surprise, and was a really different way of looking at something. I would never have thought to look at it like that. So
really shows how deeply he'd thought about it as well.
Yeah.
Board as a story.
Yeah, I mean, when my dad was dying and I was going round to the house, my son said, he was 5, he said, I want to come with you. And I said, well, it's going to be quite upsetting. And he said, I don't mind, wait a minute. Ran upstairs and came down with a Bob the Builder hat on and a toolbox. Said, I'm ready.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, on that incredibly poignant note, I think we'll draw things to a conclusion. Thank you so much, both of you. I mean, I'm sure I speak for everybody. You know, it's just so intimate, actually. Lovely. You know, even on Zoom. I look forward to reading the next ones, and it's wonderful. I mean, everything else aside, there's a sort of sense that a tap in you has been opened and you simply cannot stanch the flow anymore. I mean, how wonderful. Yeah, good. And Amy, thank you so much for being such a wonderful person to be in conversation with Susannah, and thank you everybody for being here. Do take a look, incidentally, there is a whole Second Generation Voices so-called subsection on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, including visual artists, poets, writers of different sorts, and even musicians, I think. Yes. So, you know, take a look. You might find the material there interesting, and I hope perhaps to see some of you at future events. Thank you very, very much indeed. Good night, everybody. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.